and don't count on a simplistic solution via immigration, certainly not in Western Europe or Japan, and not very likely in the US. Americans don't want to take in more immigrants. Generally, they want fewer immigrants. This shows up clearly in public opinion polls taken over the last half century. Here are fairly typical recent survey results. Question: At the present time, our law allows about 500,000 immigrants a year into the United States. Would you like to see the number of immigrants legally allowed to enter our country increase, or would you like to see the number decrease? Or do you think we're letting in about the right number now? 8% said increased, 54 said decreased, and 37 said about right now. Source: Roper Organization for U.S. News, CNN, June 1986. Such negative views on immigration are not new. They are documented in Rita J. Simon's book, Public Opinion in the Immigrant, Print Media Coverage, 1880 through 1979. A content analysis of how American publications dealt with the immigration situation going back more than a century, back when the country was still empty, quote unquote. To think that American legislators, some decades from now, with 250 million Americans in place, with America possibly under economic strain for reasons described here, will opt to open our doors to tens of millions of Asians, Latins, Muslims, or Africans boggles the political imagination. Remember, there won't be a pool of white Europeans around to draw upon. It is now an issue of race, religion, and region, as well as immigration, as discussed earlier. As will be indicated later, I favor higher legal immigration in the U.S., but I am skeptical that it can come about. It is also important to note that America will have plenty of demographically induced problems, even if, by dint of a mildly higher fertility rate and a higher immigration rate, all we do is go to a no-growth population and manage to avoid actual shrinkage. The piper for the prior birth dearth must be paid for a while. There will still be declining markets in some key age cohorts, young adults. There will still be a lack of growth and a rising dependency ratio, making it difficult to fund pension obligations. There will still be a changing geopolitical balance. There will still be the personal problems described, although all would be somewhat diminished. If all this is important, we should act now. What should we do? At the outset, let us acknowledge that, given the constraints we live under, it won't be easy. So what should we do? Let us begin by establishing some general principles. First, to remember how difficult the chore is, we ought to acknowledge that it may well be that the current fertility rates are not an aberration, but normal. Demographers have been talking for centuries about the demographic transition. That is, more modernization yields fewer children. Often implicit in that notion was the idea that the transition would level off at about the replacement rate of 2.1. But the community-wide TFR is not 2.1. It is 1.6 in Western Europe. It is 1.8 in the United States and Japan, and 1.7 in Canada. Perhaps it is in the nature of things in modern free societies that this is the logical range of rates, even though they ultimately yield an ever-diminishing population. If that is so, it means that we have to do something to change the birth dearth, because it won't likely go away by itself. Second principle: no coercion. In recent years, a few nations have resorted to coercive policies to change fertility rates. The Chinese, in an attempt to bring down population, have tried to outlaw a couple from bearing more than one child. Typically, offending parents may be subject to fines, punishment at the workplace, or difficulties with housing authorities. Women at the workplace have been subjected to regular gynecological exams to see that the one-child edict was not being violated. Ew. If there are unauthorized pregnancies, abortions are recommended by government officials. There have been some documented cases of forced abortion as late as the 9th month! Exclamation point. Not surprisingly, birth rates in China fell, and human rights, the right to bear children, were dealt a grievous blow. In Romania, coercion has been used for an opposite reason, to raise birth rates. In 1966, the government made abortion illegal. Imports of contraceptives were halted. Tough restrictions were placed on divorce. It got worse. In 1985, mandatory monthly gynecological exams were established, typically at the place of work. Failure to conceive or carry a pregnancy to term was grounds for official trouble. In addition, Romania set into motion a number of the more or less standard, voluntarily non-coercive policies designed to boost fertility. Maternity leave, tax benefits, birth premiums, etc. Not surprisingly, with the advent of pro-natal policies plus coercion, birth rates went up. To this author, it seems as if coercive government fertility policies are either immoral or wrong-headed. A couple has the human right to have children. Denying such a right, as in China, is one of the most outrageous abuses in the world today. And forcing a woman to bear an unwanted baby, as in Romania, is coercive. There are profound moral issues involved in abortion, and they will quite properly continue to be publicly aired in the years to come. But in the judgment of this author, at its root, the call for moral behavior of this sort must be faced by the parent or parents, not the state. Accordingly, the illegalization of abortion should be ruled out as a means to try to raise fertility. Third principle. The goal is to provide young people, particularly women, with more options, not fewer. The purpose of the exercise is not to return to a pre-feminist era in which feminists allege women went barefoot and pregnant, had so many children they didn't know what to do, and didn't have any other choices. In keeping with those criteria, this author rules out the idea of illegalization of contraception, or of making contraception more difficult to obtain. People have a right to shape their reproductive planning as they see fit. Diminishing that right is not the right way to increase fertility. Fourth principle. One of the options that should be made more attractive is for some women to bear 3 or 4 children. This is not an arcane theory in the realm of social or moral policy. It is the way the arithmetic works out. Figure it out for yourself. The goal is 2.1 children per woman, perhaps a little higher for a while. So women who bear 2 children are essentially neutral in this equation. To this, add the fact that there will always be some women who have only 1 child or none, by design, or because of infertility, or because they lack a mate. These days, as we have seen, the ones and nones are much more common than in earlier times. So, if a replacement TFR of about 2.1 is to be achieved, the likely fact of the matter is that some greater number of women need to have 3, 4, or more children. So, below replacement rates in the 1.5 to 1.9 range may be normal. We accept no coercion. We want more options. We want more 3 to 4 children families, and or we want fewer 0 and 1 child families. Within these demographics and ethical constraints, what can we do? First on the agenda, it seems to me, is public education. After all, we can't know with any kind of security the true natural level of the demographic transition unless the young people involved understand the consequences of their actions. Thus, it is said by some that the basic cause of the steep decline in fertility is due to greed and selflessness among young people, to yuppies run amok more interested in second cars than second children, more materialistic than maternalistic. Perhaps, but that indictment, it would seem, is at least premature. Forgive them, for they know not what they do. Yet, after all, selfishness implies knowledge of a choice. Oh! This fucking bitch. Selfishness implies knowledge of a choice. The truly selfish person must have three known options. I can act one way to help others, or another way to help only myself, or perhaps a third way to split the difference. Only with such knowledge does the truly selfish person then act to help only himself or herself. But there is another possibility concerning low fertility that has nothing to do with selfishness. Plain, raw ignorance. A young person may not sense that his or her actions may be harmful to himself or herself in a personal way, a self-inflicted social wound. And young people may not know of the broader economic, social, or geopolitical distress their actions may yield in the future. So far, it seems to me, those sets of choices have not been properly posed. In America, the case for the harmful effects of very low, below replacement fertility has barely surfaced. People should not be called selfish if they don't know they're causing problems for others or for themselves. Consider one example. We live at a time when the popular rhetoric has highlighted the population explosion, rather than the remarkable drop in fertility rates. Thus, we are still told that a population bomb threatens the third world, although fertility, while still quite high, has been falling there for 15 years. The third world fertility today is not much higher than U.S. fertility in the peak baby boom years. We have been told implicitly and explicitly that too many people is a major cause of the third world poverty and illness, although many economists, demographers, sociologists, and family planners believe no such thing. Indeed, a 1986 National Academy of Sciences study makes clear that high population growth is, at most, a minor cause of the afflictions of the poor nations. Remember, additional people produce as well as consume. Rapidly growing countries can be on an ascendant economic track. It happened in the US, Europe, and Japan in earlier times. In any event, the idea of demographic crisis in the third world has slopped over to our part of the planet too. The Western world, indeed, went through a baby boom. That, we were told, would leave us overcrowded, polluted, and under-resourced. But the baby boom ended more than 2 decades ago. We proceed to go into a population freefall and ended up at birth dearth levels. Yet, every time a new McDonald's opens up, or we're caught in a traffic jam, or Yellowstone is filled up with tourists, we are told that the U.S. is too crowded, thus confusing additional discretionary wealth, which provides people with cars or vacation time to visit Yellowstone, with added population density, which has little to do with these problems. Resource prices have tumbled, indicating abundance, not scarcity. Pollution levels are down. Still we hear it, the U.S. is too crowded. It is any wonder that such mal-educated young environmentalists worry about whether to bring one more mouth into this crowded, hungry, smoggy land. If you think I'm kidding, recall what actress Joan Woodward recently said on the subject. Unless there's some reason to believe things will change, why provide more fodder? That is one small example of distorted education. But it brings to mind an analog for our current situation. It is the old theory of the commons, recently repopularized by none other than the environmental movement itself. Recall it. English sheep raisers look at a large and luscious greensward, the commons, in the middle of a small village. It is public property, open for use to all. Each sheep raiser muses to himself. If I graze my sheep there, that will give me free fodder, and it won't hurt the commons. Why, it will even keep the grass trimmed. True enough. And so the first farmer acts that way, in his self-interest, then a second, in his self-interest, then 5, 50, 100, all acting in their own perceived self-interest. But soon, the commons have been ravaged. It becomes a rutted slum in the middle of the once fair village. And so we see how individual acts of apparent harmless self-interest can inflict great harm upon the collective interest. The intellectual basis for environmentalism has been to educate the public that individual or corporate acts of self-interest, be they littering or air pollution or water pollution, may harm the common good. For example, one factory putting industrial wastewater in a river may be harmless enough, or even enable a manufacturer to produce goods inexpensively, make a good profit, and keep jobs in the U.S. But 1,000 factories polluting a river may prove to be both unhealthy and unaesthetic. Once the public understands that, the environmentalists have demonstrated that voters are often prepared to act in ways they perceive to be in the general public interest rather than in their own private interest. That's so even if they live upstream from the polluters. Public opinion polls show that voters are even willing to pay higher taxes and higher prices to clean up the environment. So here's our analog. Most young adults these days have decided that having a few children or none is in their immediate present private best interest. Look at that green grass on the commons. But they have not yet been educated that such private decisions may have a harmful public effect or a harmful personal effect. They do not know that the birth dearth may ultimately hurt them due to busted pension plans or economic dislocations or domestic turmoil. They do not know that the ramifications of the birth dearth can yield a world inhospitable to values they cherish. They do not know that in some nations, not the U.S., the birth dearth could yield, let us say it, a withering away. And my sense is that many are not fully aware of the potential personal sorrow that may befall them. The commons may be in the process of being ravaged. So the first course of action is education. We will never know how low is low until the participants in the game know what's happening in the commons. Accordingly, let us call a moratorium on calling yuppies. Oh my god.
So is he saying, like, using, like, the tragedy of the commons logic, like, fishing too much? So if you're not having kids, you're pulling too much out of the system or something? You've heard of the tragedy of the commons, right?
The thing that I just read?
Yeah, it sounded like it.
Yeah, I think I've heard about that with, like, other stuff, but not comparing it to, like, having a bunch of kids.
Yeah, that's kind of creepy when you make it like that. It's supposed to be resources like food and water. That's what the tragedy of the commons, I thought, was for, generally.
Well, he was using it as, like, an, analogous to it or something.
Yeah, I mean, he didn't say tragedy of the commons, he just kept using the word commons, but I assume he meant that.
Yeah, I think that's the theory of the commons.
Oh.
Alright. Accordingly, let us call a moratorium on calling yuppies and other young people selfish until they understand that their private choices will have public and private effects that they may not like. Once educated, they may act differently. Indeed, the root purpose of this book is to begin to popularize the problem and the need for the necessary education.
Oh.
If we can educate our young people that the birth dearth is important, then what? All the analogies of